Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. My guest today is Heather Remoff, author of What's Sex Got to Do with It? Darwin, Love, Lust and the Anthropocene. Heather first discovered flaws in Darwin's theory of sexual selection during her doctoral research in the 70s. And she spent the last 40 years developing her understanding into it and related fields, including economics. What's Sex Got to Do with It is her attempt to add insight to Darwin's work so that it can accommodate advances in genetics and in female mating choice, advances that were unavailable to Darwin when he wrote The Descent of Man, his sequel, if you will, to The Origin of Species and his exploration of sexual selection. In this conversation, we learn about all the work Heather has done that took her from sociology in the beginning all the way through her PhD in anthropology at Rutgers and beyond. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So Heather, you've written a book, and I've got the preprint before me. What's Sex Got to Do with It? Darwin, Love, Lust, and the Anthropocene. I just wonder if you can give us a brief introduction as to how you got into this topic.
Well, I've always been curious about everything. And as a kid, I grew up around a lot of animals and observed different animal behavior. And so I became very aware that there was a connection between genes and behavior. You know, different breeds of dogs behave differently, etc. Now, obviously, they're not different species. So always curious about those things. And then as an undergraduate, because my older sister wanted to be a veterinarian and I didn't want to follow in her footsteps, I decided, well, I'll go into human behavior. And so I enrolled in sociology. And my very first class in sociology, they said, well, the basic assumption underlining sociology is that all behavior is learned. And that just took me up short because I knew from my experience with animals that not all behavior was learned. And maybe in humans, they're saying it was, but even then I understood that we were animals. Evolved animals. But I went through 3.5 years of undergraduate school, just acting as if I believed that because I wanted to get good grades. And then I finished my undergraduate work, got married, had children, and, just felt the world can't hear what I believe and went about my business. And then I met a friend who began impressing on me the works of a popularizer of evolutionary theory, a gentleman called Robert Ardrey. And I began to read Robert Ardrey and I thought, oh, sociology is ready for me now. I'll go back to grad school. At that point I was working as a teacher. I was married. I had 2 small kids. So I enrolled in a night school master's program. And in the very first class in sociology I took, the professor said, now the underlying assumption behind sociology is that all behavior is learned. And I thought, what? The field is still not ready for me. But bless that department. I mean, it was a night school department, so I would show up for classes and then go home to housework and kids and doing lesson plans for my next day of teaching. For my master's thesis, again, from an example in one of Robert Ardrey's books about ringdoves, one of Darwin's favorite species, pigeons, that in a hierarchy of female ringdoves, if they injected them with testosterone, quickly the hierarchy reversed itself, and the female ringdove who'd been on the bottom of the pile suddenly was at the top of the heap. And I thought, that would be so interesting to do that with humans. Now, obviously, you can't inject humans with testosterone, at least not someone who's going for a master's in sociology. But my program allowed me for a thesis and master's in sociology. My master's thesis was on the ranking of women in small all-female groups as correlated to their testosterone levels, existing testosterone levels. And once again, the things I get the exact opposite thing I'm expecting to get. I thought I'd find a positive correlation, but I had 3 groups of women. I got perfect negative correlations in 2 of the 3 groups, and a strong negative correlation in the 3rd group. The endocrinologist with whom I was working was stunned by that. But it was that research in sociology, and bless that department for allowing me to do that as a master's thesis, that kind of turned me on to Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox, who had a new program at Rutgers in sociobiology. And they were interested in my master's thesis, and I was accepted into that program, even though at that point I'd only had 1 class in anthropology, but I was accepted into their anthropology department, which had a strong sociobiological.
Your experiments showed that there was an inverse correlation between a female's testosterone levels and hierarchy in a group.
Yes. Yes, exactly opposite what Robert Ardrey had led me to expect. Now, I never pursued that any further at that time. This was back, in the early 70s. I've been doing this, thinking about these things for a long time, Jonathan. But at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of research done on testosterone in women. And at that time, the assumption was that the levels were fairly constant throughout their menstrual cycle. I don't know if that's still true or not, because I've moved on to other things. So it made the research a little bit easier because I didn't have to control for the menstrual cycle, where there'd be a large fluctuation in estrogen and progesterone. So that was what inspired that. But it was Lionel and Robin's curiosity and, recognition that, here's someone who's interested in biology and behavior in humans, that I think got me accepted into the program at Rutgers with very little background in anthropology. And I went to Rutgers knowing exactly what I wanted to study, because my goal in life was never to be a professor. The only time I ever went back to school, with the exception of my undergraduate program there, I just felt I should get a college degree. But the only time I enrolled in graduate programs was when there was a question that I was really curious about, and I couldn't find the answers in books. And so if somebody else had done the research, then I lost interest in it. I was curious about the things that I couldn't find answers that satisfied me in books. And so that's why I went back, enrolled in the graduate program at Rutgers, knowing what research I wanted to do.
And what was that, the research?
I knew I wanted to interview women and find out what traits influenced their choice of sexual and reproductive partners. And I'd applied to other graduate schools. One of them would have been a degree in biobehavioral science. And I'd taken some genetics and chemistry in between getting my master's thesis and going on to getting a PhD program, because I felt I probably needed a better understanding of those things than I had. But the other programs I applied to, for example, the research assistantship, the assistants I would have had would have been things like counting guinea pig copulations. And I was really much, much more interested in counting human copulations. What can I say? So I ended up going to Rutgers. And, I've had some wonderful male mentors, even though I bristle at the fact that women are largely overlooked. And the reason male mentors, because there weren't really female mentors for me. But when I was interviewing at Rutgers, and Lionel Tiger was interviewing me, and I said, now I have no background in anthropology. And this almost makes me cry. He said, "We don't care where you've been, we care where you're going." And I'm sorry, I'm a bit emotional about that, because I hadn't had a lot of encouragement in my life, and that, someone seeing that I might have ideas worth listening to. And so even though I can be impatient, that when I was finished with my research, the main thing that caught everyone's attention was that I documented the importance of courtship feeding in humans. And I don't think anyone had done that before. That was the thing that caught everyone's eye. But even then, I was most interested in wait, there's something economically going on in humans that's very, very different from what's happening in other species.
Mm.
So
what else did you find out as part of your research then?
What else did I find out? Well, things that didn't necessarily please me. Slippery memory, and I forget about research once I've satisfied myself that I've done it right. But that the traits that women listed at the top of the heap was what I coyly coded as control of material resources. Someone else might call wealth, but that was at the top of the heap. So was intelligence, and but intelligence was really relative to the woman doing that I was interviewing. It was a very subjective measure, and I did open-ended interviews. Luckily, because I was in the anthropology department, the brightest female student in our program was a more typical anthropologist. She had her people, and she went and she studied, and she said, oh, Heather, one thing, make sure you always take a tape recorder, because there will be things in there that you would otherwise miss because you're not expecting to hear them. Vicki gave me that fabulous advice, and in that way I avoided some confirmation bias, as I mentioned briefly in this book, and I think in my earlier one as well, because taking someone out for a meal, in terms of the courtship feeding, taking someone out for a meal in this country is such a typical part. Let's go out to dinner, at least in my youth, part of the dating experience, that I sort of stopped listening when women began talking about menus they'd had 30 years before. I kind of, I'll just listen and let them talk until they've described what the shrimp scampi tasted like. But then toward the very, very end of doing your interviews, I was tired. I tried not to coach my respondents, but one woman told me that her husband was and remained the sexiest man alive, the sexiest man she'd ever known. And I said, tell me what traits trigger that response. And she was so embarrassed. She couldn't think of anything. I said, well, think about the last time he did something that made you feel that way. What was it? And she said, I know. He brought me 2 pineapples. He brought me 2 fresh pineapples. And at that point, I pictured a little lizard or some other creature for whom courtship feeding is important, scurrying toward its would-be partner with a gift of food in its mouth. And I thought, wow, courtship feeding, I wonder if that triggers desire in humans. So I went back and I'd paid to have someone I didn't type at that time, to type up transcripts of all my interviews word for word. And I went back through them, and there it was everywhere, courtship feeding. Not so much a matter of, we went out for dinner, but women remembered in detail what they'd eaten immediately before they had sex with a man for the first time. So at that point, I thought, courtship feeding. Of course, that is very interesting. And people found that a lot of fun to talk about, much more fun than economics. But the other thing that my research revealed, I was expecting, again, total Darwinian when I first undertook this. Darwin was my hero. I was not as sensitive to his misogyny and bias against the Irish at the time as I now am. But I totally expected that the men that these women described as the most successful would be the men who had the most children. In fact, just the opposite was true. Like my master's thesis, my confirmation biases get smacked by my own research. In fact, as we know in humans, those who have a good control of their economic situation tend to have fewer children. And we are very reproductively successful by doing that. In terms of getting our genes into the genes of the next generation, and in humans, it's, we'll get to, this is this, I'm convinced, the source of the environmental damage we're doing, but that's a bit longer road down, but that's really how I got interested in all this. So I left Rutgers knowing that neither Charles Darwin nor I knew nearly enough about economics. Neither one of us knew a thing about the human economic system. I sensed that it was very different from what other animals were doing. If I look back through my dissertation now, I was kind of very curious about R and K selected species. Again, the numbers game, some biologists at the time were aware that it wasn't all about numbers, that some animals like the elephant have just very few offspring and yet are successful. Others, like the ocean krill, have a gazillion. And so the only way to make sense of numbers as a measure of reproductive success was to tie it to other factors. And I sensed then, oh yeah, the other factor you have to bring in is the way the resources are controlled. And so I was already thinking about those things, but I thought, I don't know enough about economics. And so because I had no desire ever to be a professor, I always knew writing was what I wanted to do. I began to self-educate on economics and began to read, every week I trek up to the public library in Philadelphia where I was living at the time and check out the standard texts in economics, and the internal logic of them escaped me. I'd reach a point where I think this doesn't make sense. It can't possibly be true. And one day when I was leaving the library with my fresh stack of books in economics, there was a little flyer on the checkout counter that said Henry George School of Economics. Now, I'd gone briefly for 2 years to a small private boarding school called George School. And so when I saw Henry George School, all I saw was George School. So that little flyer caught my attention. And then it said, they're Henry George's birthplace, and they offered free courses in economics. And I knew Henry George's birthplace well. I'd walked by it on my way to the Reading Terminal Market. And I thought, maybe I should enroll in classes there. And then that's how I became interested in Henry George. And again, because I'm a contrarian, the whole time I'm reading Progress and Poverty, I'm fighting Henry George. I'm right. If you looked in the margins of my book, I'll say, aha, not so fast there, Henry. Fighting. Then he began to win me over when I realized he had no more admiration for Thomas Malthus than I did. I saw Malthus as the source of Darwin's flaws. I thought, so maybe this Henry George is worth listening to. And then about halfway through the course, the phenomenon that Georgists refer to as seeing the cat, I had my see the cat moment when I thought, this makes perfect sense. And I could, following that logic, could begin to predict, okay, I can see how this is going to work. So the internal logic of Henry George's philosophy won me over. And at that point, I became an economic activist. I got very involved in serving on George's boards, etc. And the evolutionary biology drifted away from me a little bit for, maybe 20 years. And then when my late husband was offered a teaching job in Massachusetts, we moved here, and I'm very close, a bus ride away from Harvard and MIT and the Radcliffe Institute, and all those wonderful institutions have fabulous public lectures that anybody can go to. And I started going to them. I'm hearing the giants in the field at the moment they're making their discoveries, when their discoveries are fresh. And my interest in evolutionary biology came roaring back at that time. Suddenly I thought, oh, wow, this all makes sense. And I began to go to all those lectures, and then different pieces would capture my attention. And that's sort of the background to how I got to write this book. And you're one of the earliest readers. Not many people have read it since it's finished. My editors and you and the gentleman here in Massachusetts who has some background in population genetics and is quite fascinated by the book, which is really encouraging to me. But I forget where I was going with that. Oh, he described it as when he was first reading it, he said, I feel like I'm working on a jigsaw puzzle, Heather. You're giving me lots of pieces, and I sense they're all going to come together in the end. And I said, oh, Len, you're exactly right. That's what it is. Because I'm curious in so many different fields, I pick up a bit of information here, a bit of information there. And if it's something that seems true to me, but that doesn't really fit with existing theory, I kind of push it off to the side like you do when you're doing an actual jigsaw puzzle and you want to get the edge pieces first. Okay, these pieces are going to be interesting. I'm not sure how. Either I'm going to have to reject them when I find out they're wrong, or I'm going to have to find a theory that they fit into. And so in writing the book, I felt like I wanted my reader to kind of pick up the bits and pieces of information I'd picked up along the way. And then as a result of discussions at the Science Book Club for the Curious, which is sponsored by the Museum of Science here in Boston, and just reader events at the Harvard Bookstore, where again, people with such interesting books come and discuss it. And then the lectures at Radcliffe and Harvard, the pieces of the theory that are in this book really began to fall into place. And I saw suddenly, Henry George taught me the link between human economic behavior and inequality, human inequality. That's how I got into being an economic activist. I was just outraged by the unnecessary level of inequality. But it was after I moved to Massachusetts that I began to see, wow, this also explains the kind of climate damage that we're currently experiencing. And so I think that is my biggest, inequality is still really important to me, but I'm afraid that climate change is such a threat to us that in a way I was forced to find my voice.
Well, and as we'll get into in later the later conversation, I think you make a very clear point about how they're both connected, right? The inequality and the environmental damage and feeding off each other. So on the book, then, who would you say are your ideal readers?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Well, certainly the gentleman who just quite by accident is reading it here or has read it here in Arlington. And as I told him, oh, Len, you're my ideal reader, because he has just enough of a background in the science of it. And then he just has one of those curious minds. I'm hoping that anyone who's concerned about climate change will be a reader. I'm hoping that people concerned about inequality will be a reader. But I think anyone, just the general public who's kind of curious about how the world works, is my dream reader. And people who are willing to look at their own behavior and wonder how it fits into a larger pattern. So I think anyone with a curious mind, and of course everyone's interested in sex, so when people understand that it's related to Darwin's theory of sexual selection, of course my ideal reader would be those gatekeepers in biology, who I think, in terms of, the reader that I would like to most influence, I think probably gatekeepers in biology, to make them understand that they really have to be looking at theories of human evolution and I want them to take a more pragmatic approach to understanding human behavior. Humans are doing a lot of damage. And if we're going to address that damage, we have to design policies that are consistent with what I think is human species specific behavior. So we need a better understanding of that. So that would be who I'd most want to influence. But I'm hoping other people will read it, be entertained, and think about their own privilege and their own behavior in terms of our social problems and our climate problems.
So what was the hardest part about writing the book then?
The sense that the sands in my hourglass are running out. That was both the hardest part and the motivating factor. You know, there's that expression, don't let the great be the enemy of the good. I thought, wow, I really have to take that to heart. I know that I have some ideas that are really important and really valuable. I know that I'm an imperfect vehicle to express some of those ideas, and yet I don't see anyone else doing it. And if I'm ever going to do it, I better do it now because time is running out. I have a New Yorker cartoon enlarged and tacked above my computer just to keep me at work on the days when I thought, oh, I might rather go cross-country skiing or read a good novel. And it shows a gentleman with a top hat, obviously some kind of a publisher, talking to an old bearded guy behind a desk in a library surrounded by books. And from where I'm sitting, I can't read the exact line under it, but it says something. You have time for one more book, as long as it doesn't require too much research. So I would look at that and I think, oh, I really need to learn more about that. I mean, Heather, you have a central idea here. Get on with it. You know, you want to make sure you're still alive by the time this book gets published. So
You've done it. Yeah.
Hey, so I'm here. I don't yet have a physical copy in my hand, but that's what pushed me on. Get this done while you're still alive. You know, you at one point in life, you reach a point where, oh yeah, mortality is a real thing, and yeah, nobody manages to sidestep it.
So what did you enjoy most about writing the book then?
Actually, I loved the process. Sometimes it's hard to sit down and get started. I'm a solitary person. I know I appear to be gregarious, but I'm a gregarious recluse. I really like being alone. So it's sometimes hard to get started, but once I get into it, have you ever done writing? I'm not.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of at some point get into sort of a zone. I used to run marathons, and that runner's high is very familiar to me. And, you know, where in the beginning it hurts and you're cold, and then all of a sudden you just get this endorphin rush. I have the same thing happen to me when I'm writing. When I get into it, the process takes over, and it's almost like a runner's high. And so that was fun. And I like playing with ideas. And even though I say I'm a recluse, I like the sense of communicating with other people. And so while writing, I would envision someone who might be entertained by what I'm writing. And so I would have that sense of a social connection. One time I sent something to a friend who's a fellow writer, because at the end of the day, sometimes if I was captivated by what I'd written that day, I would fire it off to a friend. And Vicky responded back. I said, oh, I just think this is so funny and so erotic. And Vicky emailed back. She said, Heather, I don't find anything either funny or erotic in what you've written, but your writing is really grand. So that, I may have an odd sense of what is humor or what is erotic. You've read the book. I hope there were places that you found funny,
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
I think my news is hard in terms of what we're doing in terms of environmental damage. And so I want to keep my reader engaged with the sense this isn't all gloom and doom. There is some humor in just the human absurdity, that we have to see the humor in some of it. So I hope there's some funny stuff in there.
Well, I mean, one of the things that does stand out would be what it was in Jeff Bezos's pants that was attractive to women, and it wasn't the idea that he would send dick pics was a revelation that I really would rather not have had. But I guess he is
on that one.
Richest guy in the world, and he's still a guy, right? Yep. So. Is there anything in the book, any terms or concepts that would be helpful to define for our readers before they get into it?
I think concealed ovulation is something that puzzles people. And my daughter will say, "Oh, Mom, no, concealed ovulation is not the answer to everything." But in fact, in terms of human evolution, it's a pretty big deal. And because I'd had a background in farm animals, not that my family were farmers, they weren't, but at one point we rented a property with a barn, an empty barn and 10 acres. And my two sisters and I began filling that barn with every furred, feathered, and finned animal creature you could think of. And so I had experience with other animals, and I knew that, there were periods of estrus or heat that were very visible. And when a female was in heat, at that point, people didn't keep their dogs at home. We're talking now the 50s, the early 50s. That far, you'd be driving along the road and there'd be a little parade of male dogs trekking along, very determined. You knew exactly where they were going. Someone in the neighborhood had a female dog in heat, and they were all on their way to pay a visit. So I was very aware that humans were quite unusual in terms of concealed ovulation. And that just means when we're fertile, when a female is in a fertile period, it's not obvious to everyone around her. It may not even be obvious to her at a conscious level. At some hormonal level, I think that it is obvious. Certainly the women I interviewed gave me the sense that their behavior, their choice of men may have been different. But again, I wasn't doing hormonal work with them. I wasn't working with an endocrinologist on that particular bit of research. So I think the idea that humans are very unique in having concealed ovulation is quite central to my book, because, as I say, it raises female choice. It really gives it far more power, because women do have more control. They're not suddenly just swarmed. So I think that's one concept that would be pretty important for people to grasp the potential importance of that. And the idea of chromosome fusion, for someone who's uninterested in genetics, that may, an end-to-end fusion of chromosomes. I mean, I think the general public is aware of the kinds of anomalies that can happen, during meiosis and mitosis, and what happens when chromosomes don't separate, sort of horizontally, but the end-to-end chromosome fusion is not as common, because there's the telomeres that protect the ends of the chromosomes. And so that's something that I think is an interesting concept that was fairly new to me. Again, I learned of that end-to-end chromosome fusion from a book we were reading in the science book club. I mean, so many of the ideas that I have in there are, there's the puzzle piece. That's the missing piece. And so I think that's a really significant concept. And the only science popularizer that and I put myself kind of in that category. I don't view myself as a specialist, except maybe in female choice in humans and sexual selection in humans. That would be, if I could claim any specialty, I think that would be it. But the only popularizer of science that I know who's paid attention to chromosome fusion is Adam Rutherford, who you may know who he is. In his book, when it was published in the States, I think the title was Humanimal. It had a different title in the UK, but he mentions chromosome fusion in there as being the origin of our species. And I thought, wow, nobody goes there. And, you know, rather than the slow, gradual, again, the Darwinian assumption that's so basic that no one thinks to challenge it, the gradual shaping of species. Adam Rutherford said, no, it looks like human origins were pretty abrupt as the result of this chromosome fusion. So I think that's a really important concept to go into it with. And in terms of concealed ovulation, that reminds me of another experience I had at Rutgers, one of my eureka moments. A primatologist, I was trying to explain to one of the primatologists why I thought it was important to interview women about their mate choice in terms of how humans evolved and female choice. And he looked at me, he said, oh my God, anybody who's ever seen the pandemonium that results when a female chimp is in heat, it's an orgy, could ever consider that there's such a thing as choice, that females have any choice at all. And he laughed and walked down the hall laughing and shaking in his head how crazy it was for me to think that females exercised any choice. And that was the moment when I thought, oh, concealed ovulation. That's the difference that makes a difference between humans and chimpanzees. And that's the difference that makes a difference. That's how we evolved to, I mean, all you have to do is look around at the impact we've had on the world, our language, all of those things. Although, as I speculate in the book, I think some change probably occurred in the way our brains are wired, programmed at the moment of that chromosome fusion. I think it was the brains and the ovaries that were impacted most by that fusion.
Amazing. So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Actually, I'm working on hoping that this book has an impact. And if it does, I'm not thinking in terms of another full-length book. Although in the past, when I was trying to have my ideas heard and couldn't get the ear of any of the gatekeepers, I mean, I would pitch to agents, and just couldn't get, because I'm not formally affiliated with the university. I don't have that background. My only claim to fame is I have a very curious mind. And theories, I love to play with theories and, you know, try to fit pieces together and give me a concept, an idea of how something really works. But at one point I had an agent, I'd say, okay, I'll write fiction. I'll get my ideas out there in fiction. And so I wrote a trilogy, a fantasy trilogy, which was very arrogant of me because I don't read fantasy, and tried very hard with these ideas in it. I thought I'll get my ideas out there through fiction. But one agent that I pitched said to me, no, he said, I don't handle fantasy. He said, but wow, if you ever wanted to write a nonfiction book, I'd be open to any nonfiction book that you wanted to pitch me. At that point, I was only in my 70s, and I thought, oh, I'm much too old to undertake a work of fiction. It requires far too much research. All of the cartoon above my computer, but eventually, my sense of concern about the climate just made me no, it's okay. You have to do your work in nonfiction now. And luckily, Shepheard-Walwyn was open to the idea.
But yeah, I mean, having read it with them, like one of the first readers of the book, it really does feel like it's a culmination of a lifetime of work and of curiosity, which is really what when I look at some of the ideas that you came from, it's like, wow, I had no idea that could be impactful. And then the more I've thought about it, is, like the whole thing around the concealed ovulation and the whole thing around the importance of sexual selection and how the importance of female choice being regarded as being such an unimportant aspect of evolution, and the whole thing, how how evolution can go. It happens at a glacial pace and then very suddenly, and how that can happen when people are actually making conscious choice rather than it being randomly selected, as you talk about in the book. So it was a really interesting read. So thank you very much.
Hey, well, Jonathan, thank you. You've just established yourself as my dream reader. Okay, if that's what you took from the book. You and Len and my editors have now fallen into, I've got 4 of you in that category. I can't wait till the book's out there. Maybe we can get Adam Rutherford to find it interesting as well. I don't know, but the fact that those points came through to you, that gives me more joy than I can express.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of fun reading it.
That fun is what I want. Thinking should be fun, right?
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website, www.shepheard-walwyn.com, and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading